Chernobyl Evolution by Dmitry Chekhov. Chapter 1. Into the Shadows.
Pavel moved cautiously through the dense underbrush, his senses sharpened by the oppressive weight of the night. The moon hung low in the sky, its light smothered by thick clouds that seemed to swallow the world whole. The air reeked of damp earth and decay, the stillness broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. This was no ordinary forest. It was a boundary, a forgotten scar on the land where nature had reclaimed its dominion.
He had grown up with stories of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, tales of abandoned buildings and mutated wildlife, of ghosts that whispered through the crumbling streets of Pripyat. The radiation had preserved this place in a nightmarish limbo, untouched for decades. But tonight, Pavel had encountered something far worse than myths. A hulking figure moved through the trees with unnerving grace, its presence barely disturbing the undergrowth. Its eyes, cold and intelligent, glowed faintly in the darkness. Not a wolf, not a bear, something else. His pulse thundered as he pressed himself against a fallen tree, trying to slow his breath. The creature had torn through his squad before they even had a chance to fire. It had moved with impossible speed, striking with ruthless efficiency. Their screams still echoed in his ears. Now he was alone. The silence around him felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. He knew better than to stay in one place for long. He had to move, had to find his way back to civilization. Someone had to know what was lurking in the zone. Gathering his courage, Pavel pushed forward into the darkness, aware that the hunter was still out there. Watching, waiting. Chapter 2. Unnatural Curiosity.
Dr. Katya Volsky stood at the front of the dimly lit briefing room, her fingers tightening around the edges of a thick folder. The air in the room was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and cigarette smoke. A panel of stern-faced officials sat before her, their expressions unreadable as the projector hummed to life behind her.
One by one, the images flickered onto the screen. The first was a body, or what remained of one. Limbs twisted at unnatural angles, the torso ripped open with surgical precision. The second showed deep gashes in a tree, slashes far too large and too deliberate to be from any known animal. The third, a grainy, black and white security photo, captured a shadow, something enormous lurking at the edge of an abandoned checkpoint.
Katya swallowed hard. She had seen the aftermath of mutated wildlife before, boars with extra limbs, fish with translucent skin, but this was different. This was not evolution. This was something else.
This attack happened 3 nights ago,
The lead investigator said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but his fingers drummed anxiously against the table.
A military reconnaissance unit, only one survivor, he's en route to Kiev for questioning.
Katya glanced at the last image again. The shape in the photo was blurred, but she could see the unmistakable glint of eyes, watching the camera.
This isn't a natural mutation,
She said finally, her voice even despite the unease curling in her stomach.
This is deliberate.
A murmur spread through the room. The officials exchanged wary glances, some leaning in to whisper among themselves. You're suggesting this creature was created?
One of them asked. Katya hesitated. She had dedicated her life to understanding the fallout of Chernobyl, the strange and often terrifying consequences of radiation. But deep down she knew that nature, even when warped by disaster, did not create something like this. Something this intelligent, this brutal. I'm saying we need to be prepared for the possibility,
she said carefully, silent.
Then the lead investigator nodded. That's why we need you in the field. You'll work with a military task force to identify and neutralize the threat. Whatever this thing is, we cannot allow it to roam freely.
Katya exhaled slowly. She had spent years in the zone, studying its secrets. But this time was different. This wasn't just research. This was a hunt. Chapter 3. Consequences of Progress. Morning brought an eerie stillness to the exclusion zone. The skeletal remains of buildings loomed through the mist, their cracked facades standing like gravestones in a forgotten cemetery. The distant call of crows echoed through the empty streets of Pripyat, breaking the unnatural silence.
Pavel stumbled forward, his body aching, his breath ragged. He was alive.
He had spent the night hiding beneath a collapsed bus shelter, his rifle clutched to his chest. Every shadow had felt like a threat. Every rustling leaf had sent his nerves into a frenzy. He had barely slept. How could he, when he had seen what that thing could do? His squad was gone. The Grim Wulf, as the soldiers whispered in hushed voices, had slaughtered them with surgical precision. He had seen its intelligence, the way it watched them, calculated its movements. This was no mindless predator. It was something else. And now he had to make it out.
Pavel tightened his grip on his rifle and pushed forward, his legs protesting with every step.
He had to reach someone, anyone, who could believe what he had seen. Meanwhile, Dr. Katya Volsky and her research team stood at the checkpoint, their equipment loaded onto a convoy of military vehicles. Soldiers milled around them, checking their weapons, their movements brisk and efficient.
Katya adjusted the strap of her backpack, her eyes scanning the landscape ahead. She had spent years in the exclusion zone, studying its mutations, cataloging the evolutionary consequences of radiation. But this was the first time she was heading in with the express purpose of finding something designed to kill.
A voice called.
She turned to see Colonel Ivan Mirov, the head of the military task force assigned to accompany them. A hard man with a face like weathered stone, his uniform crisp despite the dust that clung to everything around them.
"We move in 5 minutes,"
he said.
Katya nodded, but before he could turn away, she spoke. "Colonel, has there been any word from the survivor?"
Mirov exhaled as if weighing his words. "He's en route to Kiev, but from what little we've gathered, he's in a state of shock. Keeps talking about something watching him from the dark."
Katya's stomach tightened.
They all knew the stories, of the mutated wolves, of the shadows that moved when no one was looking. But this wasn't just folklore anymore. Something was waiting for them in the zone. And she had the uneasy feeling it already knew they were coming. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. The skeletal remains of Pripyat rose around them as the convoy rumbled deeper into the exclusion zone. The once thriving city was now a graveyard of Soviet ambition, its buildings crumbling under the weight of decades. Nature had reclaimed the streets, vines twisting through shattered windows, rusting amusement rides creaking in the wind.
Katya sat in the back of a military transport truck, her fingers drumming against her knee. The soldiers around her were silent, their expressions unreadable beneath their helmets. They were trained for combat, but were they prepared for what awaited them?
The briefing reports had detailed attacks that defied logic. Bodies ripped apart with brutal efficiency, their remains found days later, as if something had been toying with them. Katya had studied enough to know that predators killed out of necessity, but this was something more. Something personal. Her thoughts were interrupted as the truck came to a sudden stop.
Mirov, seated near the front, immediately grabbed his radio. "Report."
The response crackled back. "We have a survivor, single male, approaching on foot."
Katya's heart skipped.
She climbed out of the truck, stepping onto the cracked pavement as the soldiers fanned out, their weapons raised. A lone figure stumbled toward them, clothes torn, face pale, eyes wide with terror. Pavel.
He looked barely human, exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. His rifle was slung across his back, but his hands trembled violently. Mirov stepped forward. "Identify yourself." Pavel lifted his head, his voice hoarse. "Private Pavel Zakharov, 2nd Recon Unit." He swallowed hard. "My squad is dead."
Katya felt a chill creep down her spine.
Mirov narrowed his eyes. "What happened?"
Pavel's mouth opened, but for a long moment, no sound came out. His eyes flickered to Katya, something desperate in them. Then he spoke.
"It wasn't an animal,"
he whispered.
"It thought before it killed. It was hunting us like we were the prey, like it enjoyed it."
His breath hitched.
"We didn't stand a chance."
Silent, Mirov studied him for a moment, then turned to Katya.
"Your call, Doctor. What do you think?"
Katya exhaled slowly. This wasn't just radiation-induced mutation. This wasn't nature adapting.
This was something designed.
She met Pavel's gaze. "Show us where it happened."
Pavel hesitated. Then, with a slow nod, he turned back toward the ruins of the Chernobyl wilderness, and they followed him into the unknown. Chapter 5. Between Men and Monsters.
Pavel led them into the depths of the exclusion zone, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Every step forward felt like trespassing into something ancient, something that had been left undisturbed for far too long.
Katya walked beside him, her scientific mind warring with the primal unease crawling up her spine. She had spent years studying the zone, yet nothing she had read or experienced had prepared her for the fear in Pavel's eyes.
This is where it happened.
Pavel said hoarsely, stopping near a ruined checkpoint. The rusting skeleton of an old Soviet transport truck loomed nearby, its cabin door torn open, claw marks deep in the metal.
Katya crouched beside it, running her fingers along the gouges. 4 deep marks, spread evenly, precise.
Mirov and his men spread out, scanning the tree line. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no insects, nothing but the distant howl of the wind.
This doesn't make sense.
Katya muttered.
Wolves don't behave this way, even mutated ones. This was a calculated attack.
Pavel turned, his face shadowed beneath the overcast sky. I told you, it's not just a predator. His voice dropped lower. It's something else.
One of the soldiers, a younger man named Sergei, muttered under his breath, gripping his rifle tighter. Ghost stories.
Pavel's head snapped toward him. Tell that to the rest of my squad.
Sergei paled, but said nothing.
Mirov turned back to Katya. You're the expert, what are we dealing with?
Katya exhaled, choosing her words carefully. If this is a mutation, it's unlike anything we've seen before. The intelligence, the efficiency, it's not natural. She hesitated before adding, but I'm not convinced it's entirely an accident.
Mirov's eyes darkened. Meaning?
Katya stood, meaning someone, at some point, might have created it.
The words hung heavy in the air. Then, from the trees, a sound, a low guttural growl. The soldiers snapped their rifles up, forming a tight perimeter.
Pavel's grip tightened around his own weapon, his voice a breathless whisper. It's here.
And from the shadows, something moved. Chapter 6, Bonds and Betrayals. The growl reverberated through the ruined checkpoint, sending a primal chill down Katya's spine. The soldiers tightened their formation, rifles raised, scanning the dense undergrowth for movement.
Pavel didn't breathe.
He had heard that sound before, just before his squad was slaughtered.
Mirov signaled for silence, his eyes locked on the shifting shadows at the tree line. The undergrowth rippled, branches swaying as if something massive was moving between them, watching.
Then it stopped. The forest fell silent once more.
Katya exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to wipe the cold sweat from her brow. It's testing us, she murmured.
Mirov's jaw clenched. We're not waiting for it to make the first move. Form up. We advance.
The unit pushed forward, deeper into the zone. Pavel moved beside Katya, his hands still trembling slightly.
This thing. It could have attacked us already, he muttered under his breath.
Katya nodded, eyes scanning the environment, which means it doesn't want to kill us yet.
Yet?
She didn't answer. As night fell, they made camp inside the remains of an abandoned research outpost, one of the many facilities scattered throughout Chernobyl's outskirts. It was a relic of the past, rusted filing cabinets overturned, broken glass crunching beneath their boots, faded papers littered the ground, the words smudged from years of exposure.
Katya ran her fingers over one of the documents. The ink had mostly bled away, but she could make out a few key phrases. Subject failed to exhibit expected aggression levels, modifications unsuccessful, awaiting further instructions.
Her stomach twisted. Someone had been experimenting here, tampering with nature.
Pavel crouched beside her. What is it?
She hesitated before handing him the paper. Proof, this thing wasn't born, it was made.
Pavel's face darkened as he skimmed the document. Why would they make something like this?
Katya shook her head. That's what we need to find out.
Before Pavel could respond, a gunshot rang out from outside.
Mirov's voice roared through the radio. Contact! We've got movement!
Pavel and Katya scrambled to their feet. The soldiers outside were already firing into the darkness, their muzzle flashes illuminating a massive silhouette weaving between the trees. Then came the screams.
Pavel grabbed Katya's arm and yanked her behind cover as something crashed through the perimeter.
The Grim Wulf had come for them. Chapter 7, The Hunt Intensifies. Chaos erupted around the research outpost. Gunfire rattled through the night, the sharp staccato bursts echoing through the decayed ruins of the exclusion zone. Shadows moved unnaturally fast, weaving through the trees like smoke. Pavel could barely see it, but he could feel it, the Grim Wulf. Muzzle flashes briefly illuminated the beast's outline. It was massive, larger than any natural predator. Its dark fur blended with the night, its eyes burning with an unnatural intelligence. It wasn't just attacking, it was playing with them.
Fall back to the building, Mirov bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Pavel grabbed Katya's wrist and pulled her toward the entrance just as the creature lunged. A soldier standing nearby screamed as the Grim Wulf's claws tore through him. His body lifted off the ground like a rag doll before being hurled into the darkness.
Katya clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. The remaining soldiers retreated into the outpost, slamming the rusted metal doors shut behind them. Heavy boots thudded against the concrete floors as they barricaded the entrance, their breathing ragged. Outside,
Pavel pressed his back against the wall, his rifle gripped too tightly in his hands. His heart hammered in his chest. "This isn't an animal," one of the soldiers panted, his eyes wide with terror. "It's something else, something."
the ceiling above them shuddered violently. Dust and debris rained down as the Grim Wulf moved across the rooftop, its claws scraping against rusted metal.
Katya's breath caught. "It's testing our defenses," she whispered.
Murav's voice was grim. "We can't stay here. If it wants in, we won't be able to stop it."
Katya hesitated, then pulled a crumpled document from her pocket, the file she had found in the outpost. She unfolded it, scanning the text quickly. "It wasn't just created," she murmured, her stomach knotting. "It was engineered to obey."
Pavel stiffened. "Obey who?"
Katya swallowed. "Someone who isn't us."
A low, guttural growl vibrated through the walls. The Grim Wulf was waiting, watching, and it was far from done with them. Chapter 8. Fractures of Trust. The oppressive silence inside the research outpost was almost worse than the chaos outside. The Grim Wulf had stopped moving, but its presence loomed, a shadow in the dark, unseen but undeniably there.
Pavel's grip on his rifle was white-knuckled. His body screamed for rest, but his mind knew better. The second they let their guard down, it would strike.
Katya crouched beside him, her fingers tight around the document she had found. Her pulse thundered in her ears. If she was right, if this creature had been engineered, someone had to be controlling it.
Murav was pacing near the barricaded door, his jaw set in frustration. "We can't sit here waiting for it to pick us off one by one." He turned sharply toward Katya. "You said it was engineered. Can it be controlled?"
Katya hesitated. "Could it? I don't know," she admitted. "But if it was created to obey, then there has to be a failsafe, some kind of override."
Murav exhaled sharply. "Then we find it."
One of the soldiers, Sergei, scoffed. "And what if it's a lie? What if we're just playing into someone's hands?"
Pavel eyed him carefully. There was something off about his tone, something that wasn't just fear.
Katya frowned. "You think someone sent us here on purpose?"
Sergei didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward Mirov, then back to Katya. "I think this mission was compromised before we even set foot in the zone." A tense silence fell over the group.
Pavel's stomach twisted. Had the government known about this thing? Had they sent them in knowing they wouldn't all make it out? Murav's expression darkened. "We complete the mission. That means identifying the threat and eliminating it."
A sharp thud against the roof made them all freeze. The Grim Wulf was still toying with them.
Pavel clenched his teeth. "Then let's finish this before it finishes us."
An hour later, they moved out. The team navigated through the ruins of Pripyat, their boots crunching over shattered glass and debris. The towering skeletons of Soviet-era buildings watched them like silent sentinels.
Katya's eyes were sharp, scanning the structures for anything that might resemble a control station. A lab. Something, anything, that could tell them who had created this thing. Then she saw it.
A rusted bunker, half hidden beneath layers of overgrowth.
Pavel saw it too. "That's not just another abandoned building," he murmured. Murav signaled for them to move.
Katya's pulse spiked as they approached. The metal door was slightly ajar, scratched and dented, as if something had tried to claw its way in.
Not out.
She exchanged a look with Pavel. Who or what had been trying to reach what was inside?
Murav nodded. "We're going in."
The darkness inside swallowed them whole. And somewhere in the distance, the Grim Wulf watched from the shadows. Waiting. Chapter 9. Confrontation at Pripyat. The bunker swallowed them in darkness. The air was thick with dust, the scent of rust and decay clinging to every surface. Their footsteps echoed through the abandoned corridors, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness.
Pavel's grip tightened on his rifle as they moved deeper inside. Something about this place felt wrong. Not just abandoned, but deliberately erased.
Katya ran a hand along the wall, brushing away layers of grime. Beneath the filth, she could make out faded Soviet insignias, along with something else. Numbers, a designation code, Facility 27. She exchanged a glance with Mirov. This was a research site.
Mirov nodded grimly. Then let's find out what they were hiding.
They pressed forward, their flashlights casting long, flickering beams through the corridor. The deeper they went, the colder it became.
Then Katya saw the first body.
A scientist's skeleton, still wearing the remains of a decayed lab coat, slumped against the wall. The bones had deep, jagged scratches, as if something had ripped him apart from the inside.
Katya swallowed hard. This isn't just an old bunker, she whispered. It's a graveyard.
They reached what looked like a central control room. Rusted terminals lined the walls, their screens shattered, wires hanging like severed veins. Katya moved quickly, brushing dust off a pile of scattered documents.
Experiment Protocol 12B. Subject exceeded expectations. Increased cognitive abilities observed. Containment failure likely. Adjusting measures accordingly. She felt her chest tighten. This isn't just about a mutation, she murmured. This was an experiment in intelligence.
Pavel frowned. Then why was it abandoned?
Before she could answer, a low mechanical whine filled the room. One of the monitors flickered to life. Static danced across the screen before an old video feed appeared. The image was grainy but unmistakable. A group of scientists stood around a containment cell. Inside, something moved, its form blurred. The camera zoomed in.
Katya's breath caught.
It was the Grim Wulf, only smaller, weaker, but still watching. One of the scientists turned to the camera and spoke, his voice distant, warped by time.
We created something we cannot control.
The screen cut to black. A long silence stretched between them.
Mirov exhaled, his voice low. So it wasn't an accident.
No, Katya whispered. It was a weapon.
Pavel's stomach twisted, a weapon left behind. A sudden crash from outside sent ice through his veins.
They weren't alone. Mirov raised a fist. Move out, now.
But it was too late. A shadow filled the entrance, blocking their only exit. The Grim Wulf had found them, and this time, it wasn't here to play. Chapter 10, Revelations and Ruins. The Grim Wulf stood in the doorway, its massive frame silhouetted against the dim bunker lights. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, unblinking, calculating. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with unnatural speed, the beast lunged. Pavel barely had time to react before gunfire erupted around him. The soldiers opened fire, their bullets ripping through the air, but the creature was too fast. It darted between shadows, weaving through the chaos like a specter of death.
Pavel grabbed Katya's arm, yanking her back toward the control room. Go! Now!
She stumbled but followed, clutching the documents she had found. The truth, everything about what this place had created, was in her hands.
Mirov's voice barked orders behind them. Hold your ground, keep firing!
Pavel spun, raising his rifle, just as the Grim Wulf slammed into Sergei, its claws tearing through his chest like paper. The soldier didn't even have time to scream. Pavel fired, the gun's recoil jarring his shoulder. The bullet struck the creature's flank, making it snarl in frustration, but it barely staggered. It was learning, adapting. Katya and Pavel reached a narrow maintenance tunnel at the back of the room. He shoved her inside first, following as the walls shook from the impact of the fight behind them.
Mirov's voice came through the radio, tight with strain. Zakharov, get her out of here. We'll hold it off. Pavel hesitated. That's a suicide mission. Go.
A gut-wrenching snarl echoed through the corridors. Then silence.
Pavel clenched his jaw and Katya forward. We have to move.
They ran. The tunnel opened into an underground chamber. Unlike the rest of the bunker, this place was untouched, pristine.
Katya's breath hitched.
The walls were lined with containment pods. Most were empty, shattered, but one remained intact.
Pavel approached carefully, raising his rifle as he stepped closer. The glass was covered in frost, obscuring whatever was inside.
Katya wiped at the surface, her fingers trembling.
Inside, something shifted. Then its eyes opened.
Pavel took a step back.
Katya stared in horror.
It wasn't the Grim Wulf. It was something else. And it was still alive. Chapter 11. Cracks in the fabric. The thing inside the pod moved, its body sluggish as if waking from a deep sleep. Its eyes, too human, too intelligent, fixed on Katya.
Pavel took another step back, his rifle trained on the glass. Tell me that's not what I think it is.
Katya's stomach twisted. It wasn't just another creature. It was an earlier version, a prototype.
Before she could answer, a low mechanical hiss filled the room. The pod unlocked. The creature stirred, pressing a clawed, malformed hand against the glass. Then the door slid open.
Pavel reacted first, raising his rifle. Stay back.
The creature stepped forward, its body leaner than the Grim Wulf's, its limbs slightly more human, as if it had been caught between forms. Its skin was pale and stretched, its muscles tensed as it studied them. Then it spoke. The voice was a ragged whisper, thick with pain and something else, resignation.
Katya's blood ran cold.
Pavel's grip tightened on his weapon. What the hell?
The creature staggered forward. Kill me before it finds me. Before Katya could react, a deep, familiar growl echoed through the bunker. The Grim Wulf was coming.
Pavel's eyes darted to Katya. We don't have time for this.
But Katya hesitated. If this thing could speak, it meant it still had some human intelligence. Some memory of what it was before. Wait, she said, it knows something.
Pavel gritted his teeth, but he didn't fire. Then make it fast.
Katya turned to the creature. What is it? What do you know?
It shuddered, struggling to stand. They tried to control it, but it learned. It broke free. Its breath hitched. And now, it's coming for you too. Pavel swore under his breath. Then the walls trembled. A shadow appeared in the doorway. The Grim Wulf. It had found them, and this time, it wasn't letting them go. Chapter 12. Descent into Danger. The Grim Wulf stood in the doorway, its massive frame blocking their only exit. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, its breath slow and measured, not out of exhaustion, but calculation.
Pavel raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. Slowly.
Katya and the prototype, the twisted, half-human creature, moved behind him. The Grim Wulf didn't attack, not yet. It was waiting.
Katya's mind raced. It could have killed them already. The fact that it hadn't meant something else was at play. Then she saw it.
The prototype was staring back at the Grim Wulf, and the Grim Wulf was staring at it. Recognition. The prototype took a shaking breath. I know you.
Pavel stiffened. What?
Katya's stomach twisted. They were made in the same facility, she whispered. This one was an earlier version, a failed version.
The Grim Wulf growled, not out of rage, but something deeper.
Katya suddenly understood. The prototype wasn't just some discarded experiment. It was the Grim Wulf's predecessor, and it was never meant to survive.
The bunker shook violently, dust falling from the ceiling. The Grim Wulf's muscles coiled, its gaze still fixed on the prototype. The creature stepped forward, its breathing ragged. They did this to us, it whispered. We were supposed to be perfect. The Grim Wulf growled, a deep, primal sound that sent shivers through Katya's spine. Then in a flash, it lunged. The prototype didn't move.
Pavel fired first, his rifle kicking against his shoulder as rounds tore through the air.
The Grim Wulf barely flinched. It slammed into the prototype, lifting it off the ground. For the first time, the prototype didn't fight back. It just stared, and then, in a voice barely audible over the chaos, it said, I was never meant to live. With a sickening crunch, the Grim Wulf ended it. The room fell silent. The Grim Wulf turned back to them. Its job was done. Now it was time to finish them.
Pavel grabbed Katya's wrist. Run!
She didn't argue. They bolted through the bunker, sprinting down the darkened corridors. The Grim Wulf was right behind them. The bunker was collapsing around them, years of decay finally giving way under the monster's rampage.
Pavel spotted a hatch ahead, a rusted emergency exit leading back to the surface. Go, he shouted.
Katya climbed first, her hands slipping on the cold metal rungs.
Pavel was right behind her. The Grim Wulf charged.
With one last burst of strength, Pavel kicked the hatch shut behind them, just as the bunker caved in.
A cloud of dust and debris exploded around them as they emerged onto the surface, gasping for breath. For a long moment, neither of them spoke.
Then Katya whispered, Is it dead?
Pavel looked back at the collapsed bunker. The Grim Wulf was buried beneath tons of rubble, but somehow he wasn't sure, because somewhere in the ruins, beneath layers of steel and concrete, he swore he still heard it breathing. Chapter 13, Origins and Omens.
Pavel and Katya stared into the wreckage, their chests heaving with exhaustion.
For a long moment, nothing moved.
Then Pavel lowered his rifle.
Katya wasn't so sure. She listened carefully, her heartbeat pounding in her ears.
There was no growl, no movement, no sound.
But she still felt it.
The Grim Wulf had survived worse than this. It had outmaneuvered them at every turn. Could something as simple as a collapse really be the end of it?
Pavel must have sensed her hesitation. Katya.
She turned to face him.
We need to go.
They moved through the exclusion zone in silence, following the abandoned roads toward the outskirts of Pripyat. The once majestic city loomed in the distance, an empty graveyard of Soviet ambition. The Ferris wheel stood motionless, its rusted frame a reminder of the world that once was.
Pavel's grip on his rifle never loosened.
Katya clutched the documents she had taken from the bunker, her fingers pressing into the brittle paper. The truth, the real story of what had happened in Facility 27, was in her hands.
The world would have to know.
They built it, she murmured.
Pavel glanced at her. What?
She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. The Grim Wulf. It wasn't just an experiment, it was a weapon.
Pavel exhaled slowly, and they lost control.
Katya nodded. They tried to kill it, but it was too smart, too strong, so they buried the project, destroyed the records. She held up the files in her hands. At least most of them.
Pavel's jaw tightened. So what happens now?
Katya hesitated. They had witnessed what the Grim Wulf was capable of. If the world knew what had been created here, what would they do with that knowledge? Would they destroy it, or would they try again? She looked toward the horizon, the first hints of morning light breaking over the ruins of Chernobyl. I don't know, she admitted, but I think we just uncovered the beginning of something much bigger.
A distant howl echoed through the empty city.
Katya's breath hitched.
It was faint, barely audible over the rustling wind, but they both knew what it meant. The Grim Wulf was still out there, watching, waiting, and next time, it wouldn't be alone. Chapter 14, Leviathan and Lament. The distant howl lingered in the morning air, a ghostly echo reverberating through the ruins of Pripyat. Pavel and Katya stood motionless, listening.
It was impossible. The Grim Wulf had been buried, hadn't it? Pavel's grip on his rifle tightened. We need to move now.
Katya nodded, forcing her legs to obey. They resumed their march, heading toward the old evacuation route leading out of the exclusion zone.
But the tension in the air had shifted. They were no longer escaping. They were being watched. By midday, they reached the edge of the zone. The old Soviet checkpoint stood in ruins, its rusted gates still standing, the final barrier between Chernobyl and the outside world. Beyond it, a convoy of military vehicles waited.
Pavel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They sent backup.
Katya wasn't sure that was a good thing.
As they approached, a group of armed men stepped forward. Not regular soldiers. Government. One of them, a man in an expensive suit flanked by 2 armed escorts, met them halfway. Dr. Volsky, Private Zakharov. His voice was calm, but his eyes were cold.
Katya's fingers tightened around the documents she had taken from the bunker.
He already knew.
Pavel tensed beside her. What do you want?
The man gestured toward the convoy. Come with us, we have much to discuss.
Katya's stomach churned.
This wasn't a rescue. It was containment. An hour later, they sat inside a reinforced transport, the road leading back to Kiev stretching endlessly ahead. The man in the suit sat across from them, studying them like specimens in a lab. We appreciate your efforts, he finally said. You've uncovered a great deal. Katya didn't reply.
Pavel crossed his arms. Cut the bullshit. You knew, didn't you?
The man smiled, a thin, hollow expression. We suspected, you confirmed.
Katya leaned forward. And what happens now?
He exhaled, as if considering his words carefully. The Grim Wulf project was never supposed to be discovered. The program was shut down decades ago for a reason.
Pavel narrowed his eyes. You mean because it got out of control?
The man's expression didn't change. Because it was inconvenient. A cold dread settled over Katya.
This wasn't about the Grim Wulf itself. This was about the technology behind it. The ability to create something stronger, faster, smarter than anything nature had ever produced. She leaned back, suddenly feeling sick. They're going to start again, aren't they?
The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside the window, the ruins of Chernobyl disappeared into the distance. But something remained behind. Something waiting in the shadows, biding its time. And next time, it wouldn't be an accident. It would be a design. Chapter 15, New Beginnings. The road to Kiev stretched ahead. An endless ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the Ukrainian countryside. The military convoy moved steadily, the low hum of engines the only sound breaking the heavy silence inside the armored transport.
Pavel sat stiffly, his hands curled into fists. Across from him, the government official in the suit remained eerily calm, watching him and Katya with the patience of a predator.
Katya's mind raced. The truth of what they had uncovered in the exclusion zone was far more horrifying than she had ever imagined. Not just a mutation, not just an anomaly, a weapon, and now she and Pavel were being escorted not as survivors, but as assets. Katya broke the silence first. What do you want from us?
The suited man tilted his head slightly. I think you already know the answer to that, Dr. Volsky.
Katya's grip on the documents in her lap tightened. These files contained the last remnants of Facility 27, proof of the Grim Wulf's origins, of its engineered intelligence, of its potential as a bioweapon.
Pavel leaned forward, his voice low and tense. You want to start it again, don't you?
The official smiled, not a denial.
Katya's stomach twisted. You think you can control it this time, she said quietly, but you can't.
The man's expression didn't change. What happened in Facility 27 was unfortunate, but science is about progress. He folded his hands. And progress, as you know, often comes with setbacks.
Pavel's jaw clenched. That setback killed an entire research team. It slaughtered an elite military squad.
The man exhaled through his nose, as if this was an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. That's why we have you now.
Katya's breath hitched.
The man smiled again, calculated. You two survived, he said. You studied it, fought it, lived through encounters that no one else did. His eyes flickered to the documents. That makes you valuable.
Katya shook her head. You think we're going to help you?
The man's smile didn't waver. I think you'll come to understand that this is bigger than personal opinions.
Pavel's hands curled into fists. You're playing with something you don't understand.
The official's smile finally faded. On the contrary, Private Zakharov, we understand it perfectly. A heavy silence followed. Then the convoy slowed.
Katya glanced out the reinforced window. They weren't in Kiev yet.
Pavel tensed. Where are we?
The suited man reached for the door handle. Your new home. The door swung open. Beyond it, nestled in the distance, was another facility. Larger, more fortified, and fully operational.
Katya's heart plummeted.
They weren't shutting the program down. They were expanding it. And now, she and Pavel were part of it. Like it or not, a low, distant howl drifted through the air. Somewhere, in the shadows, something was still waiting. And this time, it wouldn't be alone. The end.